On behalf of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, closely associated with the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London, greetings and a very warm welcome to this evening's seminar given by Sonia Lambert, and her topic is the experiences of a group of Jewish refugees to Britain in 1940, stories which inspired both her historical novel, Sea Air, and her PhD. These men could be described as the unluckiest, or perhaps the luckiest group of internees. They were held in British camps before being deported by ship in 1940 and survived the sinking of the Arandora Star, only to be deported again on the infamous Dunera to a camp in Australia. Lambert will read an extract from her work and talk about the sources she used and the ways in which the experiences of the internees resonate today. Her writing is through the medium of the novel, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce her. Sonia Lambert's first novel, Three Mothers, was published by Piatkus in 2008, and she has written for BBC Radio 4 and The Guardian. She holds an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia and a PhD from Goldsmiths University of London. She currently works at the Refugee Council and is extremely busy there, especially at this time of crisis. So please, Sonia, let us hear your seminar. We look forward to hearing what you've written. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. So as part of my PhD in creative writing, I've been writing a factually based novel about internment during the Second World War, and I'm calling my novel Sea Air. For my research, I read accounts written by refugees who were interned by the British in 1940. It's been such a fascinating project for me, and I'd like to share some of their stories with you today. So we've heard quite a lot in the past few weeks about Britain's so-called proud history of helping refugees. It's been interesting for me because I've been asking myself the question, how proud can the British really be of our treatment of refugees in the 1930s and 40s? It's a really big question. I'm not going to answer it fully here, but these are some stories that I'd like to throw into the mix. My grandmother came to this country as a refugee in 1938. And I think, like many people, I vaguely assumed that Jewish refugees who were escaping the Reich were straightforwardly welcomed to this country. But in fact, as I've read more about it, I've come to see that although there were inspiring acts of generosity by individuals and organizations, the official position was more like approximating one of indifference, sometimes hostility, and often bureaucratic cruelty. So I would argue that there are many parallels with today, but not perhaps the ones that we're always choosing to highlight or remember. The Internment of Refugees is one episode from that period that challenges the comforting illusion that the British government's response was generally enlightened or benevolent at that time. So for my PhD, I focused on one group. As we said in the introduction, they could be described as maybe the unluckiest, or depending on how you look at it, some of the luckiest of the internees who were held by the British. They were Jewish or partly Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria, and they often described themselves as anti-fascists, and they were deported by the British in 1940. So the four men I'm going to talk about today survived the sinking of one ship, as we'll see, and were then deported on another ship to Australia. So what was internment? I will give you a bit of background for those of you who come to this fresh, but I also appreciate that many people in the audience already know quite a bit about it or had a personal family experience of this themselves. So please forgive me if I'm stating stuff you know already. When the war broke out, there were many Austrians and Germans in Britain, and they abruptly became known as enemy aliens. As you might expect, the huge majority were refugees. There were some other people who just happened to be living or working here. So once war was declared, these people were called to appear before tribunals, and they were graded A, B, or C, according to the perceived threat they posed. Now, people sometimes argue that this system was working fairly well at the beginning. I disagree. Even from the start, I think the process was confused and inconsistent, and many of those interned were very clearly refugees and no risk to national security. So it was a bad policy to start with, which got even worse. In late 1939 and early 1940, there was a press campaign to intern more people. The Daily Mail urged that, quote, enemy aliens should be interned if there is the slightest doubt, and asked if Nazi spies are successfully masquerading as refugees. The war was going badly for Britain, and after the fall of Holland, this pressure intensified, with many rumours about a so-called fifth column of hidden German sympathisers. So in a panic-driven measure, over 30,000 enemy aliens were interned over the summer of 1940. The majority were Jewish refugees and some were communists. They were quite often both. These were joined by Italians, some of whom had lived in Britain for a very long time. And with the camps filling up, the British authorities hit upon the disastrous plan of deporting thousands of internees to Canada and Australia. So this is an article by Hannah Arendt in 1943. And as she implies in this quote, the people who experienced this persecution often kept quiet about it, especially at first, both in order to forget and because nobody wants to know. It's a complicated story, and in the context of the Holocaust, of course, there's an uncertainty about how to tell it. However unlucky the internees, surely they were also lucky to have escaped and survived. All of us here have lived our lives to some extent in the shadow of these events. I feel that we should remember the internment stories as well, especially at the moment. They illustrate an uncomfortable but important truth, I feel, that every society is capable of prejudice, racism, and injustice, including our own. So my interest in this story began with an article in a local history journal. The Hackney Hoard was a jar of gold coins which were dug up in a Stoke Newington garden in 2007. There was some research done by a local Hackney historian called Stephen Selby, and he discovered that the coins once belonged to Martin Sulzbacher, who had come to North London as a refugee from Nazi Germany. So this is Martin Sulzbacher. This picture is later in his life. He was a banker from Frankfurt, and he helped many Jewish families to get money out of Germany in the 1930s, helping them to evade the regulations imposed by the Nazi government, which were intended to rob them of their savings. He was interned by a tribunal in February 1940. This is what his son wrote about it. He had the misfortune that the tribunal was presided over by a rabid anti-Semite who refused my father legal representation, and amongst other things, accused him of contravening the laws of his own country, Hitler's Germany, by smuggling his own money out of Germany. So I think the tribunal saw him as a smuggler, even though he was actually, helping his community to avoid the Nazi persecution. When he was interned, he left the gold coins, this was his own family savings, in a safety deposit box in a London bank. And when I heard about his story, I found it very hard to believe. So in order to research it and tell some of this story, I started to look for other men who had travelled with him. To my surprise, I found there were 3 others who had left detailed accounts, which were preserved and passed on by their relatives. So this is one of the other men who travelled with him. This is a Rhino Radoc. He was a young man who shared this experience. He was born in 1920, so he was only 19 at the start of the war. His father was Jewish, and after the anti-Jewish violence of Kristallnacht, the family began making efforts to leave Germany by any means possible. Rhino escaped to England on a visitor's visa in July 1939. He pretended he was on a trip to learn English. Quote, "My blue eyes and blonde hair are a great help" on the journey. Along with his two brothers, he was interned just after the start of the war. The second man I looked at was called Ludwig Hess. He was born in 1906, so he was in his 30s during the war. Like Rainer, his father was Jewish by birth, but had converted to Christianity. Life became increasingly difficult under the Nazis. Ludwig lost his position at a university. He was unable to marry his fiancée, Inge, because of the race laws. And he crossed the border to Switzerland hidden in a car. And his wife, his at that time girlfriend, Inge, rather romantically, I think, she swam the Rhine to join him in Switzerland. At that point, the Swiss had already closed the border to refugees, so she had to swim across the river to get there. And they had to pretend that they were Swiss initially. So then they came to England in 1938, got married, and they started their new life. But Ludwig Hess was interned by the British in March 1940. He believed it was a result of being denounced to the authorities by one of his colleagues. Finally, Ludwig Baruch was born in 1917, so he was in his early 20s at the start of the war. His family were Jewish, and they came to Liverpool when Ludwig was still at school. They set up in the wool trade. Then, as now, the distinction between refugee and economic migrant is a complicated one, since it's obviously quite possible to be both. And I guess they came for work but stayed because it would not have been wise to return. Ludwig Baruch was an ardent communist and became a communist in his teens because he felt this provided the most consistent opposition to fascism. It got him into all kinds of trouble. He was expelled from school for writing out the words of the Internationale instead of writing lines. After this, his political views made it difficult for him to find work and also caused problems for his parents when they applied to be naturalized as British. He was interned with his father early in the war in October 1939, probably because of his political activities. He was asked at a tribunal, I think several times, what he would do if Britain was involved with a war against the Soviet Union. And he always replied that he couldn't answer this hypothetical question, which they didn't like at all. So all of these four men were sent to a former holiday camp at Seaton in Devon, which had been transformed quite rapidly into an internment camp. Conditions were absolutely miserable. In the harsh winter of 1939 to 1940, the men were very wet and cold, and the food was very bad. They were held together with many other refugees and also German merchant seamen and businessmen who just happened to find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. So some of these men had Nazi sympathies, as you would imagine. They were just, ordinary Germans. So the tensions in the camp were very high, and I think they were fairly evenly matched as well. Even from the beginning, it was about half and half refugees and sort of ordinary Germans. As in other camps, the men found really enterprising ways to keep themselves occupied. So they had a wall newspaper, which was where they just stuck articles on a wall for people to read. And they devised a lecture series, and they even staged an operetta, which was called The Bride from Ophir. Entertainment was improved by the fact that a professional orchestra joined them from a scuppered German ocean liner with their instruments, which they'd saved from the ship. Some men made camouflage nets as part of the war effort and grew vegetables to supplement their food. So in the spring of 1940, as many more refugees were being interned, the camps were filling up. In what Churchill later described as, quote, a deplorable and regrettable mistake, the British started deporting some of the internees overseas to Canada and Australia. On 29th of June 1940, a group of about 200 of the internees at Seaton were told to be ready to leave early the following morning. Luggage was limited to £50 and matches were forbidden. From this, they guessed that they were going to travel by sea. In the evening, the train reached Liverpool and went through a tunnel before arriving at the docks. The men then boarded the Arandora Star, which was a former cruise ship, painted grey as camouflage. And you can see they had, I think, some experimental anti-torpedo sort of stuff on the side of the ship as well. Once they were on board, the men were served food on china plates, which was an undreamed of luxury since they'd been interned. They worked out from the number of Italians that Italy must have entered the war. Rhino and his brothers were happy about the rumours they were going to North America. Ludwig Baruch shared a beautiful cabin with a German ex-communist MP and met a sailor from Liverpool who was also a fellow communist. He noticed that conditions on the ship were, quote, absolutely chaotic, the decks littered with items of military equipment of all kind. He slept well, however. The beautiful ship sailed well in a gentle swell, and he was reassured by the rhythmic motion and even the noises from the engine. Just after 6 a.m., Ludwig Baruch was woken by a terrific bang being lifted several centimetres off the floor. Rhino Radoc was already in the corridor. Quote, suddenly the lights go out. The explosion rocks the ship and fumes propagate along the now dark passage. All of the men realized what was happening. The ship began to list and they went out on deck. Rhino Radoc says that there is a weird silence about the ship. The engines have stopped. We hear people in the cabins calling out. Under our feet, we feel broken glass from window panes and bulbs shattered during the explosion. Many people cannot find their shoes and receive cuts on their feet as they feel their way up onto the open decks. Ludwig Baruch met one of the soldiers on his way out, standing with his rifle and fixed bayonet. I asked him what he was doing there. He said nothing and was obviously shaken. Radoc describes the scene. People with suitcases in their hands jump overboard. Others drop from the upper decks with life vests on them. They break their necks and float afterwards between swimmers and debris. Baruch describes utter chaos on the boat deck. I told my colleagues that there was only one chance of surviving, and that was to dislodge and throw everything that would float overboard and swim safely away from the boat and cling to some floating debris. The survivors watched the ship go down. Ludwig Baruch watched from a floating bench. Quote, suddenly the bow rose skywards and the enormous ship stood vertically in the water and then disappeared within seconds, stern first, into the ocean depths. The most horrific sight was hundreds of people falling along and down the upright tilting decks and being dragged into the ocean. Ludwig Hess describes the noise, an unearthly primeval roar as the air escaped from countless openings and threw passengers high into the air, only to take them with her into the depths. Then there was nothing but open sea and wreckage. In the afternoon, the survivors who were in the water and clinging to debris and on a number of lifeboats were rescued by a Canadian destroyer, the Saint Laurent. Quote, the feeling which overcame me when, after climbing the rope, two powerful arms literally lifted me over the railings and passed a mug of rum into my hands, will stay with me for life, writes Hess. Radoc is relieved that both his brothers are still alive. Quote, once again, we have been lucky. I have a look inside the ship where the air is thick. Exhausted and wounded people lie about everywhere. Ludwig Hess was still wearing his pajamas and he was wet and covered with oil. He was given a blanket and a belt by a sympathetic sailor. Ludwig Baruch met another fellow communist who agreed to pass on a message to his family. But many of the other internees from Seaton had drowned, and the death toll amongst the Italian internees was particularly high. This is a memorial at the Italian church in Clarke. Newspapers at the time focused on panic and stories that the men fought amongst themselves. They gave the impression that all the men were prisoners of war. The men were not allowed to contact their relatives, who had to wait a very long time for information. Ludwig Baruch wrote to his fiancée Hilda, quote, "The sights I witnessed were not fit for human eyes to see. I lost all the things I had with me, including your photos and letters, and nearly all the clothes I had on." So it's hard to believe, but after a short stay in Scotland, most of the survivors of the shipwreck, including our 4 men, were deported again, this time on the notorious Dunera. So there were quite a lot of internees from other camps as well who were loaded onto this ship. On this second ship, they were robbed and abused by the British guards and locked below decks in very poor conditions without decent food. The men we're talking about here were traumatized by having already been in the shipwreck and suffered from an understandable fear that this ship too would be struck by a torpedo attack. And in fact, the ship seems to have survived a very narrow miss. They stopped in Africa to take on supplies and went on to Australia. The men didn't know where they were going, especially at first, and some of them had been told they were going to Canada, so it was very confusing for them. The journey was a terrible ordeal. They speculated about where they were heading, making calculations based on the position of the sun. They told stories to pass the time. Ludwig Baruch played a lot of chess. Eventually, they reached Melbourne, and that's where these particular men I'm describing were unloaded. And then they were met by soldiers at gunpoint and loaded onto a train. So some of the internees on this ship went to a different camp, but this particular group were taken to an internment camp at Tatura, about 100 miles inland from Melbourne. After some time, they finally succeeded in getting themselves separated from the other Germans, and there had been quite a lot of anti-Semitic harassment, so it was a relief to be separated from the other Germans. Found themselves quite literally on the other side of the world. While they were in Australia, Martin Sulzbacher, who we started with, received the devastating news that 5 members of his extended family, those who had not been interned and remained in London, had been killed in a direct hit on their house in Stoke Newington. The food in Australia was better than what they'd had before, and the camp began to develop its own routines and traditions. Radoc and his brothers managed to resume their studies and to get some textbooks delivered, and they organized another lecture series. Baruch joined a group of communists and also worked as a tailor, and they were joined by a group of refugees from Singapore who were also mostly Jewish. They found ways to brew alcohol in secret and celebrated the various different religious holidays. But there was the constant worry about their families and the beginnings now of an awful realization of what was happening in Central Europe. I think people were already beginning to find that their letters were being returned and, silenced from their families. Back in Britain, there was a growing public outcry over the treatment of the internees, and the British authorities began to realize they had made a mistake. So eventually, Hess, Baruch, and Sulzbacher were returned to Europe by ship and spent time in camps on the Isle of Man before being released in 1941 and 1942. Radoc and his brothers remained in Australia, where they settled after the war. So to return to the coins, when Martin Sulzbacher finally got back to London, he went to see what was left of the bomb-damaged house where his relatives had been killed. He also went to open the safety deposit box in which the gold coins had been kept, but he found that it was empty. So at the start of the war, everyone, and especially the refugees, was very afraid that Germany was going to invade. And they believed that when this happened, there was a significant risk that Jewish property would be confiscated, first of all, as had happened in other occupied countries. So a friend told Martin Sulzbacher that his relatives had withdrawn the coins from the bank and buried them in the back garden to keep them safe in case of an invasion. But because these relatives were all killed in the Blitz, no one knew exactly whereabouts in the garden these coins were hidden. And although Martin searched with a metal detector, he found nothing. So it was not until 2007 that the coins were finally dug up by accident. And after this research, they were restored to Martin's son. So at the time, even with all the distractions of the war, the internment of civilians was controversial. It was criticised by MPs like Eleanor Rathbone, newspapers including the Manchester Guardian, and by Francois Lafitte, who argued in a swiftly published book that thousands of innocent refugees have been treated like cattle. People felt a sort of mixture of ways about it afterwards, partly because it was much worse for some people than for others. Those who did discuss it often made light of it or emphasised the more positive aspects. And there were consolations to be found for many in comradeship or artistic endeavour. As Kushner and Cesarani put it, quote, by 1960, Second World War internment had been sanitised into a jolly jape. But others were angrier or perhaps more open about their anger. I very much like some of the illustrations by Alfred Lomnitz, like this one. He wrote a very nice memoir about internment, which he called Never Mind, Mr. Lom. So at first he was very frustrated because the British people kept telling him to never mind about internment. And he found this, odd and kind of almost offensive. What, you're locking me up and then you're saying never mind. But after his release, he began to feel a bit differently about the dismissive phrase. So he's just been released, and he confesses to a railway guard that he's been released from the camp up the road, and he's a bit afraid of how the man's going to react. Well, never mind, says the guard, and offers him a cup of tea. I hope they didn't treat you too badly there. So I think his sort of great affection for the British and the kindness of individuals goes some way to mitigate his feelings of anger. I hope you agree with me that these are remarkable stories. There's a sense in which these men saved themselves 3 times, once by escaping from Germany, then by surviving the shipwreck, and finally by writing their memoirs and giving their own accounts of what happened. I've tried to do justice to their stories in my work, and time and again I've been reminded of the saying that truth is stranger than fiction. I think of them all the time. There are many reminders, especially in my current job as a press officer at the Refugee Council. I think it's worth revisiting this past and, to me, quite shocking example of what can happen when official indifference combines with a cynical manipulation of prejudice and a need to be seen to be doing something. The strange paradox of individual kindness set against collective or state hostility is still playing out. So yesterday, Parliament voted on the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is a vindictive and pointless attack on the basic rights of refugees, undermining the whole principle of asylum. So I think of these men when I hear about recent refugees housed in former barracks in Kent, where the conditions sound just as grim and inadequate. Traumatized people fleeing war and oppression are held by the British in conditions which are becoming far less like homes and far more like camps. There are reminders too when Priti Patel says we can't lift visa requirements because Ukrainian refugees might be Russian spies. Or when we hear talk of so-called offshore processing, which would actually involve deporting people against their will. Whole groups of people are still dehumanized and degraded in an attempt to win newspaper readers or votes. So I think this episode should warn us of what can happen when press and politicians exploit and enable racism and prejudice. As well as the heroic and uplifting stories of World War II, we should also remember that we had state-endorsed persecution and internment camps here in the seaside towns of Britain. My novel, or perhaps you could call it a documentary novel, is a sort of soup made from all these stories we've talked about today and other autobiographical accounts. So I would like to read you an extract, and I would also be very happy to answer any questions. I really enjoyed working on it, and I'm looking for a publisher, so if you would like a copy, you can email me and I will keep your name such a time as I either self-publish or find a publisher. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, I really fretted about which extract to read, and I still haven't quite decided, so I'm just going to fret some more. So in my quick glass of water. In my book, I alternate between the stories that I've told, that I've outlined about the men, and the story. So it's about a husband and wife, and I tell the man's story and I intercut it with the woman's story. So it's about someone called Ludwig and someone called Hilda. And Hilda is, the women's stories are also really interesting, but she's also interned, and she starts off in Holloway prison. She's taken to Holloway prison, and then she's taken to the Isle of Man. The picture on this image is the Isle of Man. So I'm going to read you a little bit where Hilda is in Holloway prison, and then I'll read you a little bit about her husband, who is at that point just been rescued from the shipwreck. Although I'm tempted to read you a bit of the Dunera, because I think there are some Dunera people here. Someone's nodding. Okay, maybe I'll read you a Dunera bit. Okay, cool. I like to get feedback. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read you a bit where they've just arrived in Australia. Okay, but you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to really try hard not to do Australian accents, because they will be terrible and embarrassing. So Ludwig's just arrived in Australia, and he's on a train leaving Melbourne with his fellow internees and some Australian guards. And in the bit I'm going to read next, Hilda's on the Isle of Man, waiting for their son to arrive by train. So, encouraged by this approachability, the other men begin asking cautious questions. What season of the year is it here? Which part of the country are they in? Will it be a long journey? Now they see wooded hills with small farms. The trees are a different shape, beautiful, ancient, and straggly against the sky, which is now an astonishing blue. Are there no kangaroos, no emus? Felix asks. Give us a chance, says the soldier with a laugh. After a while, the soldier ventures a few questions of his own. You fellas look like you could do with a slap-up meal and a decent shave. Where did they capture you? Didn't the Poms give you any tucker on that ship? The lure of a sympathetic ear is overwhelming. They tell him of their troubles, first with a proud reticence, but soon with a tumbling eagerness, a terrible need to be listened to and believed. As they relate their stories, all in a rush and out of order, the shipwreck, the thefts, the many petty pretexts for their internment, Ludwig has the feeling that it's almost too implausible to be true. The guard takes off his slouch hat and scratches his head incredulously. Struth, he says, come and listen to this, Bill. This lot say they aren't even Nazis. Bill, a middle-aged soldier with a broad farmer's face, leaves his post at the door and comes to listen. The two soldiers exchange anxious glances as the men tell their overlapping stories, interrupting each other in their eagerness. Because we came without proper documents, Fritz explains. Otto says, because we are communists. Because of a mistake about customs duty, Ludwig hangs his head. Because, Nathaniel Oppenheimer adds, because I believe he did not like the Jews. The soldiers whistle and shake their heads. Cripes, they say, and Ludwig can see they are perturbed. They have been expecting parachutists and spies, or at least battle-hardened Nazis. They seem quite willing to hear criticisms of the British. Duffers and crims, you say? Stole your gear? but they glaze over a bit when it comes to individual misfortunes, and the problems of Europe seem reassuringly far away to them. The younger one of them, Otto learns, has communist leanings and promises to inform the party in Melbourne of their plight. How is it, Ludwig asks, that you seem to find a sympathetic commie on every ship and on every continent? Otto grins. This fact gives him great encouragement. We are everywhere, he says, with a theatrical wink. You blokes are hungry, you say? The older one, Bill, inquires. The land is flatter here, wide grasslands with sheep and some cattle. We are starving, Fritz says simply, without exaggeration. The food since several months has been quite inadequate. The soldiers offer round their smokes and take out the lunches from their backpacks and share around what they have, chocolate and salty crackers. Now they see kangaroos, a whole group of them, bounding alongside the train as the men jostle and point at the windows. You see, I told you to give us a chance, the soldier laughs proudly. After a few hours, they reach Seymour Station, where a cluster of women in hats and white gloves are waiting on the platform, together with some army officers. There are trestle tables in a waiting room decked with white cloths and plates piled with sandwiches and cake. There's real butter on the bread, fruit, fresh fruit, and tea with milk. The internees are stunned, made humble and tearful by these luxuries, naming these blessings to one another with trembling disbelief before cramming their mouths with solemn ecstasy. The local dignitaries seem shocked by their appearance, and the ladies dab delicately at their noses with handkerchiefs. The Germans bow formally and click their heels, and the Italians blow kisses. Later on, they reach a small station called Rushworth, where the local people with battered sun hats, weather-beaten faces, and simple smocks have gathered to watch the arrival of these ragged beggars from far away. The men climb off the train and into some buses. They drive through hilly grassland and eucalyptus trees. The minty pine smell mingles with the dust in their noses. The velvet dark thickens around them, and the exotic new constellations of the southern hemisphere shine out brightly on this new upside-down world. Ludwig imagines he can feel the mysterious countryside around them, rustling with strange creatures, the hills rippling out for miles in every direction. My love, you won't believe where we are now, he says to Hilda in his head. They reach their new camp. The commandant is at the gate to meet them. It looks very large. Ludwig sees rows of corrugated iron huts arranged on a hillside, lit up by electric lamps, with enormous insects swarming around. The newly skinned fence posts gleam white in the artificial light. There's a dead snake, recently killed, hanging over the barbed wire fence. Well, here we are, Ludwig thinks. Perhaps this is really as far away as it is possible to go. So the last bit I'm going to read is about his wife, Hilda, and at the same time she's on the Isle of Man waiting for her son to arrive. The longed-for children's transport is due at last. Hilda can't bear to talk to people, yet she also hates to be alone with her thoughts. What if it's cancelled at the last moment? London is bombed every night, and every hour contains the potential for tragedy. So many things can go wrong. Why would the British make good their promise to a few enemy aliens at the height of the Blitz? What if Ludwig's parents fail to understand the instructions, or decide to keep John with them, or don't reach the station in time? She has written to the older couple, explaining each step in the process, and also to Ruth and Ernst, urging them to help, but she's had no reply, and the whole thing seems impossibly complex. What if, oh God, an incendiary bomb, a collapsing ceiling, the glass from a window, a direct hit? An impatient crowd waits at the little station in Port Erin. Every mother there is beside herself with agitation, and the high pitch of their emotion seems to buzz in the air. Hilda is lightheaded and dizzy. They wait in a small forecourt at the entrance near the road, twisting their handkerchiefs and rolling on their feet, a human wave kept back by a few policemen. The camp commandant is also there, She's a fierce elderly matron in a tweed skirt and military-style coat, her white hair pinned up under a black hat. She wears spectacles and carries, somewhat unnecessarily in Hilda's view, a riding crop. She was once an important figure in the Red Cross and is now a dame, as the status-hungry refugees tell each other in solemn and impressed voices. A shiver of excitement goes through the crowd. The little train appears along the track and gives its throaty whistle, chuffing so slowly alongside the platform. Children are waving in the windows. They are much older than her little boy, however. Hilda feels certain suddenly that he cannot be amongst them. The train stops. There's an excruciating pause. The engine exhales steam, but it's the only thing that still seems to be breathing. Something is wrong. The doors aren't being opened. Ladies of the WVS confer on the platform in a cluster of dark green uniforms. Where are the keys to the carriages? As if at some prearranged signal, many of the children begin to cry, their small wailing faces white against the windows. The policemen look at each other. There are not very many of them and a lot of internees. A rebellious mutter goes through the crowd. There's thunder on the mothers' faces. They look as if they might charge forwards and tear the doors off the train with their bare hands. A genteel cry goes up from a harassed Englishwoman. Wait, I say, here they are. To everyone's relief, the keys have been found and the carriages are unlocked. The crowd can no longer be kept back and surges forward onto the platform. Order, I will have order, shouts the commandant, striding around and waving her riding crop at people, but the women are beyond caring. A happy chaos explodes amid the luggage. Everywhere she looks, Hilda sees frantic searching, mothers and children flinging themselves into each other's arms, kissing and crying, and questioning and fond scolding. Frau Oppenheimer has found her 2 older children and is squeezing the air out of them with her embrace. Oh God, Hilda thinks, the chasm of despair opening at her feet. He really isn't here. But then she sees him in the arms of a woman from the WVS. Her heart seems to stop at the sight of this one particular little face, an arrangement of features which somehow seems more familiar to her than her own. Her boy. The woman hands him over with a small suitcase. Thank you, Hilda says, shaking with relief. My pleasure. He's a sweet little thing, the woman says. Then she's breathing him in, inhaling his special smell, and he's so different, yet the same. Baby John looks bewildered and squirms in her arms. Oma, he says. Nein, nicht Oma, Mama, she says, laughing through her tears. So it's true, in the 5 months they've been apart, he's really learned to speak a few words. She feels guilty for disbelieving Ludwig's mother about this. Mama, Mama, he begins to repeat tentatively. He's a real person. This will never cease to amaze her. She's speechless with joy, but at the same time angry that she's missed so much. She's gulping and trying not to frighten him, and he's smiling delightedly, touching her face, which is all slimy with tears. Her arms wonderfully full, she struggles back to the hotel. On the street, several women offer to help her, but she has a new strength and doesn't want to pass over even the suitcase. Your son, isn't he adorable? Says everyone as they pass. They're surrounded by admirers hungry for happy endings. Miracles can happen. Perhaps things might still turn out all right after all.
Sonia, thank you very much indeed. I think your title of Sea Air is perfect, and it's counteracted by the fact that the tales of internment are not ones of jollying by the sea, as some people might have imagined. I'm not addressing the audience this evening, but some people might imagine that being interned by the sea was just a jolly holiday, and it was far from the truth. We have a little time for questions, but I must inform you that this seminar is being recorded, so if you don't wish to appear, please ensure that your camera is switched off. But you can ask a question either by holding up your hand or through the chat box. And Sonia's happy to answer questions, as she mentioned earlier on. Could I ask you myself, Sonia, if I may, how long it took you to write this?
Well, it was part of a PhD, and there was sort of more to it. So the novel was not the hard bit. The hard bit was the sort of more academic paper you have to write with it, really. But yes, actually took me about 5 years. But I was doing other things as well. So that's
how did you ever feel conflicted about how much to focus on the actual historical details and how much to elaborate in terms of your novel?
Yeah, very much so. And I still wonder if I made the right choice to write it as fiction, because actually it's so much based on true stories. It's sort of not really fiction. And maybe sometimes I think I should have actually written it just as a sort of kind of account of what really happened, because I think, I don't know, it was swings and roundabouts. I wanted to try and get inside the characters and write about their feelings and emotions, but sometimes I feel like the power of the story is the fact that it really happened. So I think, you know, I lost a certain amount by sort of writing as fiction, and I think perhaps, yes, it's sort of become quite a strange amalgam of things, but it was fun to do. I felt
what did the four men, or the men you interviewed, have they read your work, and how do they feel about it if they have?
Well, none of the men are alive anymore, the four men who were interned, but I spoke to their children where I could. So I spoke to, well, let me go back to, oh, hang on, I've got to go back to the, I spoke to, I had email interactions with the sons of Ludwig Baruch, and actually his second wife is still alive, although she's very elderly. And also Ludwig Hess, I had an interaction with his son by email. I couldn't find relatives of Martin Sulzbacher. I think they moved to Israel, and I did try and contact them. But I sort of took from the fact that these people had all left their accounts in archives, so it felt like they wanted their stories to be told. Yes, so did also. I'm in touch with the niece of Rhino Radoc, who's also doing work on her own father's story. So there's lots of people around.
Thank you. Teresa von Summer, what's your question, please? Would you like to unmute, please? Could you unmute? Teresa, could you unmute?
There you go. Just took me a while to get there.
No problem. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, Sonia, that I was extremely moved by the novel. My father was, as you can see from the chat, was on the Dunera and went to Hay. And after he died 6 years ago, I found a diary that he'd written also about his refugee experience and the experience of being an internee. It was beautifully written. So I'm sort of in the process of writing what he wrote, but adding what it meant to be his daughter and what we lived with in terms of the aftermath of that, which is my particular experience of being the next generation and how these things travel on through time. But I was also wondering whether you've tried an Australian publisher, because in Australia, everybody knows, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, about the Dunera. And I found a lot of information. I mean, it's just part of the general life there.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, how fascinating and how interesting. And it's really a very amazing story. And I would be interested to hear more about your father. And I haven't tried an Australian publisher, but so if you have any suggestions, let me know. In fact, I haven't even been, which I would have loved to have gone, but I couldn't really sort of somehow justify the cost of getting there.
That's another part of the story.
I'd love to go one day, because I know that people do. They go. I don't know if you've been to some of these reunions they have.
No, but I've been to the Jewish Museum in Melbourne, and got lots of stuff there. got my first book about the experience, which was,
wow.
So I've got your email, so I'll write.
Yes, do email me. Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you. It was a very moving piece of writing. I love the way you've, I mean, you sort of got, I mean, I recognised some of it, but it was just so, particularly the encounters with the Australian police and guards and so on. I mean, and the language, it's just fantastic.
Thank you. Oh, well, that's a relief, because I always worry that I actually had got an Australian friend to read it for veracity.
Thank you. Naomi and then Anna Nyburg. Naomi, what's your question, please?
Hello. Like Teresa, my father was on the Dunera and he was interned in Hay. And he also kept his diary. The Imperial War Museum is a good home for it, which is where it is currently. James Belgian at the Imperial War Museum, who created the new Holocaust galleries, felt very passionately about the dreadful experience of internment in this country. And he has created quite a nice little section explaining it in the new Holocaust galleries. And
I don't have to see it, yes.
You have to see it. And my father's story, actually under his original name, which is Herman Gutmann, is there. So he's an example.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
wow, we've got lots of Dunera people here. That's great. Thank you.
My question, so I'm coming to my question really is about anger, which I'm fascinated by, because my father, like many internees, played down what it was like for him when he spoke about it. And I only really explored his diary after he died. His diary is very different from the way he remembers it and recounted it in his later years. So there's that aspect. And then also, he did express his anger in later years, but it was actually directed at the government. And he really wanted to know who was responsible for organising internment and sending him to Australia. And actually, I picked up the baton and I went to the National Archives and I did a lot of research going into the correspondence at the time and the minutes. Anyway, coming back to anger, you touched on it, and I'm quite fascinated by that. So in your research, what was your sense of people's anger?
Yes, well, I think, I think they were quite angry. I think they sort of had to learn to live with it. The men, it's not a question I can really answer. You probably know more about it than I do, having lived with it your whole life. I suppose, in order to move on and live the rest of their lives, they had to sort of come to terms with it to some extent. I think Ludwig Hess was particularly angry about what happened to his wife and son. And he's the one I sort of most closely modelled this on. But the son, in real life, in my novel, the son's looked after by somebody in the family, but in real life, some of the children were sent to a children's home. And I think they were very poorly looked after. And he was very angry about that, and very angry about his wife being interned. And people were often very angry about, what happened to their things when they were locked away. People would take their things, or lots of anger. And but I obviously there were a range of feelings, I think, and I think it was never properly addressed. And I think because the narrative of the war, which dominated about the good Brits, it wasn't something people could really talk about, and a lot of people just kept silent for the rest of their lives, which I think is very sad about that.
Thank you. Could we move on to Anna and then to Stephen Gouge, or I apologise for the pronunciation. Anna, what's your question, please?
Okay, Sonia. You'll see from the chat function there are very many people who have the same shared experience and went to Australia, some of them were Dunera. And in my research, I interviewed somebody called Sarah Adams, whose husband was one of those who went to Hay Camp. He was born Georg Telcher in Austria, but he changed his name to George Adams. They had an Adams in the family. Very interesting character. He was a graphic designer, a communist, and he'd been in the Spanish Civil War helping with graphic design, making posters and so on. And he created the most wonderful diary. I know we've heard many diaries, there are many diaries, but as a graphic designer, I mean, he designed the camp currency for Hay Camp.
Oh, wow.
And he did its beautiful maps and absolutely everything beautifully chronicled. Sarah, as far as I know, is still alive. She was much younger than her husband. And when I last spoke to her, she did still have this absolutely amazing diary, which covers every single aspect of camp life. So yeah, that's just another one for you. I know it's just so annoying to meet all these people after you've done the research, but just in case
it's great as well, because it's strange when you do something like this, because you to get external verification that it really happened. I think it's quite strange, isn't it? And little ways the stories intersect as well is always fascinating. You'll hear little different accounts of the same thing happening, but from different people's stories.
Yes. Makes it all true. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We don't have a lot of time left. I'm very sorry. Stephen, would you like to ask your question, please? And then Dave, but if you could please be brief. I'm so sorry.
Of course. It feels like a book that needs to be published very quickly and very soon, although I worry that it might give Priti Patel some ideas. I wonder if you could say what you think is the most, from the research, what's the most important lesson that needs to be learnt from what you saw and the stories you found?
Well, I think that for me, the thing that really resonates was that the government always knew they were refugees and really did it as to bow to sort of public pressure and newspaper pressure that more people had to be interned. And I think, we see this with the current government. I think that doing things because it pleases newspaper readers is just a hiding to nowhere, especially if you already know that it's not the right thing to do. And whipping up, it was the beginning of the war, so obviously there was a lot of heightened emotion, but I feel like, I can see some real parallels there with I feel that refugee policy now is really cynical. It's, an attempt to manipulate people and to make them angry and frightened about refugees. And that's really just such an appallingly bad way to make policy, in my view. So
perhaps you could pursue that through email, if that's acceptable to you, Sonia.
Yes, I'll talk to Stephen about that, but very good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, if we could just squeeze in your question, please.
It's not a question, it's a brief comment, Sonia. Thank you for doing this. This is a second experience I've had recently of Zoom with the children of fellow Hay Camp Dunera refugees. They were soldiers who joined something called X-Troop, and a book was recently written by another young historian in New York about X-Troop, which some of you might like to Google and look up. But it brought together a whole lot of the children of those soldiers, and we had some wonderful exchanges of photographs and stories as a result. And the way it happened was we got through the author the email addresses, so they weren't publicized without permission, but we went back to the book author and she then connected all of us together. And I don't know whether you want to do that, Sonia.
Oh, well, that's something else, perhaps, Sonia, that you can follow up. It sounds like a
yes. Well, I would need to get. I don't know if it's possible actually to get from you guys the names of the people who've signed up, but I certainly could. If people were interested, I think there's a lot to be gained from being in touch with other people with the same interest, and it's amazing to be joined by so many people whose parents and relatives had this experience. So thank you so much for
Sonia, perhaps as we close, I'm terribly sorry, but we are obliged to end. Perhaps you'd like to put up your screen with your email address, and if people want to contact you, they can do that.
Yes, I'll try. Hang on.
Your last slide.
Yes. Let's go.
There.
There we go.
That's it.
There's my
That's
email
it.
address. So the thing about my email is don't forget the M in the middle.
Sonia, a huge thank you very much. It's obviously stimulated a lot of interest and brought people together as well, which I think is terribly important, and to have that sense of fellowship.
Yeah.
So,
I'd like to say thank you so much, both to Jane and Jana, for organising this, and thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful for me.
And to Professor Brinson, who very kindly suggested this seminar.
Absolutely, yes, she was wonderful.
Indeed, she is indeed. So I offer my thanks also to Jane, the IMLR's administrator and events manager, for, as ever, for her infinite help. And the next seminar, which might also interest you, is on the 27th of April, and it's called The Second Generation, Theoretical Concepts of the Lived Experience, presented by Dr. David Clarke. And it's an anthology, based on an anthology, The Journey Home, Emerging Out of the Shadows of the Past, which was published last year. And those details will be circulated in the very near future, but please do ensure that if you'd like to join us, that you register, otherwise you won't receive the link to join us. So I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you for joining us today. Good night.